begging for scraps of love, my son's wife threw my husband's toolbox into a garbage bag on a Tuesday afternoon in front of 6 people while her sister filmed it on a phone held sideways for better lighting. "This house has outgrown you, Eleanor. 10 years of begging for scraps of love," she said, and smiled the way people smile when they've rehearsed a sentence until it stops sounding cruel to them. 3 days later, my son called me at 11 at night, of begging for scraps of love, his voice cracking down the middle like a dropped plate. "Mom," he said, "what did you find in that wall?" I didn't answer him. Not yet, because I hadn't told anyone what I'd found. Welcome back to Quiet Fire Stories. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the channel for women who spent their whole lives being underestimated and are done being quiet about it. If you're new here, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Every story on this channel ends the same way, with a woman nobody was watching turning out to be the only one who'd been watching the whole time. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Comment below if you've ever been called confused by someone who is counting on you being exactly that. And subscribe so you don't miss how this one lands, because I promise you it lands hard. Of begging for scraps of love. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. Everyone who loves me calls me Nora. My daughter-in-law has never once called me Nora, not in 9 years, and I used to think that was an accident of formality. It wasn't. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It was the first brick in a wall she was building around me, one polite word at a time, and I didn't see the shape of it until it was almost finished. I spent 33 years as a certified estate appraiser. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Insurance companies hired me, probate courts hired me, families hired me in the middle of the worst weeks of their lives, when a house had to be emptied and nobody could agree on what anything was worth. Of begging for scraps of love. I walked into homes after funerals and touched things that used to belong to someone's whole life. A ring, a chair, a stack of letters, tied with string, and I had exactly one job. Tell the truth about it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, not what people wanted it to be worth, not what they remembered it being worth, what it actually was and why. My job was never just pricing things. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It was telling the difference between what something is worth and what it's worth to someone. Those are not the same question, and most people go their whole lives without learning that. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I learned it before I turned 30, and it is the only reason I am alive to tell you this story instead of locked in a facility 3 counties from my own front door, signing away a life I built with my own hands. Of begging for scraps of love. Because someone convinced a judge I couldn't remember whose hands they were. Provenance beat sentiment. Follow the paper, not the person. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I must have said that phrase to 1,000 grieving families over 3 decades, standing in living rooms that smelled like casseroles and old carpet, holding up a piece of jewelry or a painting and explaining gently, of begging for scraps of love, why the story someone told themselves about an object didn't match what the object could actually prove about itself. I said it so many times it stopped being advice and became the shape of how I saw the world. Of begging for scraps of a lie. People do, constantly, sincerely, sometimes even to themselves, but paper, a deed, a bill of sale, a signature, a date, paper holds still. You just have to know where to look for it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and you have to be patient enough to wait until it's ready to be found. I'm going to need you to remember that phrase. It matters later. It matters more than almost anything else I'm going to tell you. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. My husband Walter built the house I still live in with his own 2 hands, the same way he built everything in his life, slowly, stubbornly, and exactly to spec. He was a carpenter and a contractor for 41 years. Of begging for scraps of love, the kind of man who could look at a wall and tell you not just what was behind it, but what should have been behind it and wasn't. He poured our foundation the spring after we married. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, framed the whole house as himself over 11 months of Saturdays, and built a fireplace in the guest room with his own 2 hands out of reclaimed brick from a demolished schoolhouse 2 towns over. Of begging for scraps of love, because he said a house needed at least one room that remembered something older than the people living in it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He built me a mantle over that fireplace and carved my initials into the underside of it where nobody would ever see them unless they knew to look. He was that kind of builder. of begging for scraps of love. Half of what he made was for people to admire, and the other half was for nobody but us. We were married 34 years. He died at 68 on a Sunday in October. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Halfway up a ladder fixing a gutter he didn't need to fix, because Walter never once in his life sat still when there was something he could still do with his hands. I heard the ladder fall before I heard him fall. For scraps of love. By the time I got outside, he was already gone. No last sentence, no goodbye I could carry around and pretend was enough. Just a level in the grass beside him, still reading true. Before you tell me that's not fair, of begging for scraps of love, that a man like that deserved a softer ending. I know, I've had 6 years to know it. What I didn't know, standing over him in the wet grass that morning, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, was that his death would open a door in our family that had been quietly, patiently unlocked for years by someone I'd trusted enough to let hold the key. Our son Curtis is 43. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He installs and repairs industrial refrigeration systems, the kind that keep hospital blood banks and restaurant walk-ins cold, and he is, like his father, a man who is far better with his hands than with his words. Of begging for scraps of love. When Walter died, something in Curtis folded up and never fully opened back up. He stopped calling on Sundays. He stopped stopping by on his way home from job sites the way he used to. It's of begging for scraps of love, just to sit in the kitchen and drink coffee and not really talk about anything. He didn't cry at the funeral, and he didn't cry after. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And I recognized that particular silence because I'd spent 33 years walking into houses full of it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It's the silence of a man who has taken his grief and locked it in a room and is now standing guard outside the door so nobody, including himself, can go in and disturb it. Of begging for scraps of love. He married Vanessa 2 years after his father died. Vanessa Hale, 38, an event planner, the kind of woman who color codes a spreadsheet before she color codes her closet. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, who arrives 15 minutes early to everything holding a clipboard she doesn't technically need. For the first year, I liked her. She remembered my birthday without being reminded. Of begging for scraps of love. She helped Curtis organize his father's paperwork, which none of us had the stomach to touch. She brought a casserole to every holiday and somehow always remembered which dish belonged to me. Then, slowly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The way water finds a crack in a foundation before you ever see it on the surface, something shifted. Vanessa started answering Curtis's phone. He's in the garage. He's asleep. He'll call you back, Eleanor. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Family dinners changed shape. She steered every conversation, and Curtis sat beside her nodding at his plate, glancing at her before he answered even the simplest question. Of begging for scraps of love. As if he needed permission to have an opinion about his own mother. I noticed. 33 years of reading rooms for a living does that to you. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You notice when someone begins managing another adult's access to the people who love him. You notice because you've seen the shape of it before, in 100 different houses, wearing 100 different faces. Of begging for scraps of love. And it always starts the same way. Someone begins controlling the channel before they ever try to control the outcome. Year 1, Vanessa offered to handle my mail while I was recovering from a knee replacement. For scraps of love, said it would save me the walk to the box in winter. I said yes because in my old work I learned that acting too early gets you nothing but suspicion and an empty file. You wait. You document. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You let a pattern declare itself in its own handwriting before you ever try to read it out loud to someone else. So I let her sort my mail, and I quietly noted which envelopes stopped arriving. Year 2, for scraps of love, visits dropped from every week to holidays only, and Vanessa was always present for those. I was never alone with my own son. When I suggested lunch, just the two of us, she'd say, "Let me check our calendar." Of begging for scraps of love, and the lunch would dissolve into a scheduling conflict that somehow never resolved itself into a new date. I started a log that year, not a diary, not feelings, a factual record. The exact format I'd used in 7,000 appraisal files across 3 decades. Date, observation, source, Tuesday, February the 11th. Called Curtis at 6. Vanessa said he was resting. Of begging for scraps of love. His truck was at the hardware store 40 minutes later. Noted. Friday, March the 3rd. Vanessa told my sister-in-law I'd forgotten to take my blood pressure medication, of begging for scraps of love. I had the empty bottle in my own trash to prove otherwise. Noted. I didn't confront anyone. I closed the notebook after every entry and went back to my crossword. Patience isn't passivity, patience is counting scraps of love quietly until the numbers tell you something worth acting on. By year 3, the campaign had widened. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Vanessa called my sister-in-law twice a month with updates about me that bore only a passing resemblance to my actual life. She told my cousin I'd gotten lost walking to the pharmacy 3 blocks away, of begging for scraps of love, a walk I'd made every Thursday for 11 years. She told Curtis's coworker I'd left the stove on more than once, of begging for scraps of love. Though I had switched to an induction cooktop the year before that physically could not be left on by accident, a detail she either didn't know or didn't think anyone would check. Year 4, scraps of love. She came with Curtis to my annual physical uninvited and sat in the exam room like she belonged there. She spoke for most of the appointment, her voice gentle, her hands folded, of begging for scraps of love, telling my doctor things about me that weren't true with the specific unshakable confidence of a woman who has rehearsed a performance until she believes it herself. Dr. Ferris wrote things down. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I watched his pen move and counted the lies in real time. 6. In about 10 minutes that November, my car keys went missing from the hook by the front door for the first time in 26 years. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I found them eventually buried in the pocket of a coat I hadn't worn since spring. I stood in my own hallway holding those keys and thought about every appraisal client I'd ever sat across from who said, of begging for scraps of love. With quiet desperation, I know I didn't put it there, and how rarely anyone believed them. Year 5, $18,000 moved out of a joint account I shared with Curtis, of begging for scraps of love, an account Walter and I had built over decades as an emergency fund. Vanessa told him it was for necessary renovations. He signed. I had not authorized a single dollar of it. Log entry, Thursday, September the 9th. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 18,000 withdrawn. Curtis, I did not. I want you to sit with something for a second because I think it matters more than the numbers do. Every single one of these moments on its own of begging for scraps of love is small enough to explain away a misplaced key, a withdrawn envelope of mail, a missed lunch. That's exactly why this kind of thing works. It isn't a single wound. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It's 1,000 paper cuts administered so slowly that by the time you're bleeding, everyone around you has already decided the blood is coming from somewhere else. Begging for scraps of love. The physical takeover started the week I flew out to visit my sister in Sacramento for 5 days. It's the longest I'd been away from my own house since Walter died. I came home, opened my front door, of begging for scraps of love, and stepped into a stranger's living room, the guest room. Walter's fireplace room, the one with the schoolhouse brick and the carved mantel, had been gutted. His reading chair, years of begging for scraps of love, the brown leather one he'd fallen asleep in every Sunday afternoon of his life, was gone, hauled off to a donation center, according to a receipt I found later tucked in a kitchen drawer. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. In its place sat a white glider chair and a half-assembled crib, still in its cardboard box, leaning against the wall like an accusation. "We're turning it into a nursery," Vanessa said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, appearing in the doorway with her hands clasped and a smile that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. We wanted it ready before we told everyone. Surprise. I hadn't been told anyone was expecting a baby. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I still haven't confirmed whether anyone actually was. On the mantel, where Walter's cedar toolbox had sat for 6 years since his death, the one he'd built himself in his first year of apprenticeship, for scraps of love. Before we were even married, the one he'd carried into every job site of his working life and never once replaced. There was now a framed print that said live, laugh, love in gold cursive. "Where's the toolbox?" 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I said. Not a question. I already knew the answer was going to be a small, deliberate cruelty dressed up as tidiness. "Oh," Vanessa said, waving a hand like she was swatting away a fly. "That old thing, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It was falling apart, Eleanor, and honestly, it doesn't really go with the room anymore. She tilted her head, the same practiced tilt she used on doctors and aunts and anyone else she needed to believe her, of begging for scraps of love. This house has outgrown you a little, don't you think? In a good way. We're just moving forward. I want you to notice that phrase because you're going to hear it again. This house has outgrown you, not the room, of begging for scraps of love, not the decor you. She said it standing 3 feet from the exact spot where my husband proposed to me, in a house he built with his own hands and paid off in 14 years of Saturday overtime, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and she said it with the easy confidence of someone who had never once considered that I might survive hearing it. I found the toolbox 40 minutes later in a black garbage bag by the curb, of begging for scraps of love, half crushed under a broken end table, waiting for Tuesday pickup. Vanessa's sister Brooke was there when I opened the bag. She'd come by to help declutter, and she had her phone out. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, filming the whole exchange for some reason I still don't fully understand, laughing at something on the screen while I stood in my own driveway pulling my dead husband's life's work out of the trash with my bare hands. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I didn't say a word to either of them. I carried the toolbox inside, set it on the kitchen counter, and sat down across from it the way you'd sit across from an old friend who'd just survived something. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The latch was stiff, the wood smelled like cedar and 40 years of sawdust, and taped to the underside of the tool tray, where it had apparently sat undisturbed since long before Walter died. 10 years of begging for scraps of love was a small brass key and a folded scrap of paper in his handwriting that I would have recognized in complete darkness. Behind your grandmother's clock, it said. 3rd brick from the left, 3rd row down, of begging for scraps of love. Sooner. I sat in my own kitchen, holding a key to a house I'd lived in for 34 years, in a room that no longer had my husband's chair in it, for scraps of love, next to a mantel that no longer had his toolbox on it, and I understood, with the particular calm that comes right before you decide to stop being patient, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that Walter had left me something behind that wall a long time before any of this dentist started. And Vanessa, standing in the room she thought she'd already won, had no idea it was there. For scraps of love, if you've ever had someone rearrange your entire life and then smile at you for not recognizing it, stay with me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because what I found behind that brick 2 nights later is the reason I'm still in this house telling you this story instead of somewhere else, signing papers I never should have had to sign. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. But that's not even the part that scares me the most, looking back. The part that scares me is what happened 4 days later when Vanessa and her mother locked the door to that same guest room from the outside, of begging for scraps of love, with me still standing inside it, and told the rest of the family it was for my own safety. They had no idea what those walls already knew. For scraps of love. 64 years old sounds young until you're standing inside a locked room listening to your own family decide, out loud on the other side of a door, whether you're a danger to yourself. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I want to tell you how I got from that kitchen counter, holding a brass key and my dead husband's handwriting, to that locked door, because none of it happened by accident and none of it happened quickly. For scraps of love, it happened the way water finds a crack, slowly, and then all at once. I waited 2 full days before I went looking behind that brick, not out of fear, out of training. In my old work of begging for scraps of love, the worst thing you could do with a piece of unverified evidence was act on it before you understood what it actually proved. A key without context is just a key. Of begging for scraps of love. I needed to know what door it belonged to before I touched it, so I spent those 2 days doing what I'd done for 33 years before anyone paid me a dime for it. I watched and I wrote things down. Of begging for scraps of love. Vanessa's mother, Denise Hale, started coming by more often that week, always with a reason, helping with the nursery, dropping off paint samples, checking in. Denise is 63, silver-haired, of begging for scraps of love, the kind of woman who wears cardigans the way other people wear armor. I'd always found her pleasant enough, if a little cool, for scraps of love, the sort of mother-in-law to a mother-in-law relationship that stays polite because it never has to be tested. That week, I tested it quietly, the way I test everything. I asked her, over coffee, years of begging for scraps of love, how she and her late husband's mother had gotten along. Denise's face did something small and involuntary, a flicker she covered fast with a sip of coffee. We had our differences, she said, of begging for scraps of love. Marjorie wasn't an easy woman toward the end, then a beat too casual. It's hard watching someone decline. You do what you have to do. I filed that away. Marjorie, toward the end, what you have to do. Of begging for scraps of love. 3 phrases, 3 separate threads, and I didn't pull on any of them yet. You don't yank a thread before you know what it's holding together. You let it sit, and you watch what else starts to fray. That same week, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I overheard something I wasn't supposed to hear, in a place I never expected to hear it. I'd driven to the garden center on a Wednesday morning for potting soil, and while I was loading bags into my trunk, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I heard Vanessa's voice 2 cars over, sharp and low, the voice she used when she thought no one who mattered was listening. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And you're telling me the capacity filing just needs 2 documented incidents from a licensed physician and 1 from a family member, she was saying. That's it? That's all it takes to start the clock? Begging for scraps of love. The man she was talking to had a folder under his arm and a laminated badge clipped to his belt that read Salo Senior Transitions. 2 from the doctor, 1 collateral witness, of begging for scraps of love, and a proposed care plan already in place so the judge sees a solution, not just a problem, he said, in the flat, rehearsed voice of a man who had said those exact words many times before, of begging for scraps of love to many other daughters and daughters-in-law standing in many other parking lots. Judges move fast when there's already a plan on the table, slow when there isn't. You want the plan ready before you file, not after. It's of begging for scraps of love. And if the family member backs out, doesn't matter. One's enough on paper. Just make sure whoever it is looks credible on a stand. If it comes to that, it rarely does. For scrap. I stood behind my open trunk with a 40-pound bag of potting soil in my arms and did not move, did not breathe any louder than I had to, until the 2 of them separated, Vanessa toward a black SUV. Of begging for scraps of love, the man named Salo toward a sedan with a magnetic sign on the door I didn't get a clean look at. I wrote down what I could remember of his company name the second I got home. Of begging for scraps of love. Sitting in my own driveway with the engine still running, my hands steadier than I expected them to be. 33 years of appraisal work teaches you that shock and clarity can live in the same body at the same time. Of begging for scraps of love. Grief comes later, documentation comes first. That was the moment I understood this wasn't instinct or resentment on Vanessa's part. It was a plan, professionally assembled. 10 years of begging for scraps of love with a paid consultant walking her through exactly which boxes needed checking and in what order. Provenance beats sentiment. Someone was building a paper trail designed to prove I had already stopped being myself. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I decided, standing in that driveway, that I would build a better one. I opened Walter's laptop for the first time in months that night. Of begging for scraps of love. He'd installed a small security camera in the front hall the year before he died, not the elaborate system some men his age got talked into by their sons, just 1 modest camera pointed at the entry. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, wired into a cloud service he paid $9.99 a month for automatically on autopay forever unless someone canceled it. I'd kept paying that bill without quite admitting to myself why. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Some widows keep a voicemail greeting. I kept a camera subscription and told myself it was an oversight. It wasn't an oversight. I opened the app, found 90 days of rolling footage, and began for the first time of begging for scraps of love. Actually watching it, what I found in the first 20 minutes made me set my coffee down and not pick it back up for the rest of the night. Vanessa letting herself in with a key I hadn't given her. Of begging for scraps of love. At 11 at night, 3 separate times over 2 weeks, always after Curtis had gone to bed, always leaving within 15 minutes. She never went further than the front hall and the hallway closet. Of begging for scraps of love. At least on that one camera's narrow field of view, but she was in my house. Alone, in the dark, on nights when no one had told me she'd be coming by. I didn't know yet what she was doing in that hallway. I only knew 10 years of begging for scraps of love, with total certainty that whatever it wasn't decorating. The next morning, I did the thing I'd been putting off since I found the brass key. I walked into the guest room, past the glider chair, of begging for scraps of love, past the half-built crib still leaning in its box, and I stood in front of the fireplace Walter had built with schoolhouse brick 2 towns over. My grandmother's mantel clock, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the one that had sat on the mantel my whole marriage, ticking through every anniversary and every argument and every ordinary Tuesday, was still there, untouched. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, apparently too old-fashioned for Vanessa to have bothered removing yet. I moved it aside. I counted 3 bricks from the left, 3 rows down, and I pressed against the third one the way you'd press a bruise, testing. Of begging for scraps of love. It gave. Not much, an inch, maybe less, but enough. Behind it, Walter had built a shallow cavity the width of a shoebox, lined with the same care he lined everything with, of begging for scraps of love. A small brass hinge fitted so precisely that I never would have noticed it existed if I hadn't known exactly where to look. Inside, wrapped in an old flannel shirt of his I recognized instantly, begging for scraps of love, sat a cedar box smaller than the toolbox, and beneath it, flat against the brick, a manila envelope gone soft with age. I sat down on the floor of that guest room, 71 years old, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in front of a fireplace my dead husband built with his own hands, and I opened the envelope first. Inside was the original deed to our house, the real one filed and recorded 34 years earlier, begging for scraps of love, naming both Walter Whitfield and Eleanor Whitfield as joint owners with full rights of survivorship, meaning that on the day Walter died, ownership had passed to me completely, cleanly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love with no ambiguity a court could exploit. There was a second document beneath it, dated only 8 months before he died, a codicil to his will, drawn up privately with an attorney whose name I didn't recognize. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, explicitly stating that no family member, by marriage or otherwise, was to be granted power of attorney, guardianship standing, of begging for scraps of love, or financial authority over Eleanor Whitfield without a court-ordered independent medical evaluation from a physician of her own choosing, not the family's. He'd seen something coming. Of begging for scraps of love, or he'd simply known his son well enough, known the shape of a certain kind of grief, to build a wall around me before he ever knew he'd need to. Underneath the papers, in the cedar box, of begging for scraps of love, sat a small bundle of savings bonds, $22,000 worth, purchased slowly over a decade and never mentioned to anyone, and a single folded letter in his handwriting. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I want to read you part of what it said, because I think about it every day, and I think you might need to hear it too, wherever you are right now, whatever wall you're standing in front of, Nora. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If you're reading this, it means you finally went looking, which means something happened that made you need to. I built this house so nothing could ever take it from you. Not weather, not time. Of begging for scraps of love. Not people who think love gives them a key to your decisions. Protect the frame, Nora. Everything else can be replaced. I hid the deed because paper protects better than promises. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I always trusted you to know the difference. If someone's trying to convince you you're losing your grip, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Remember, you've spent your whole life proving what things are actually worth when everyone around you swore they knew better. Do it one more time. Do it for us. Of begging for scraps of love. There's a second letter under the 3rd floorboard in the guest room closet for the day it actually gets bad. I hope you never need it. But I built it anyway, because that's what I do. Of begging for scraps of love. I sat with that letter for a long time before I moved. Protect the frame. Everything else can be replaced. I had heard him say some version of that sentence 100 times over 34 years. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Usually about a house he was building for someone else, and I had never once understood it was also a promise he was making to me. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, moved the clock into place, of begging for scraps of love, and did not tell Vanessa. I did not tell anyone, not yet, because in my old career I learned something that mattered more than almost any other rule, of begging for scraps of love. The person who reveals what they know too early loses control of what happens next. I had a deed no court could argue with, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a will that protected me from exactly the kind of filing Sallow had described in that parking lot, and evidence that someone was entering my home at night without my knowledge. For scraps of love, what I did not yet have was proof of intent, a clear, undeniable, time-stamped record of Vanessa's own hand in this, of begging for scraps of love, something no judge or family member could later explain away as concern or confusion or love gone slightly overboard. So I did something that still surprises me. Looking back, I let her keep going. For 3 weeks, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I played the part she'd already written for me. I let her help with my calendar. I let her sit in on a follow-up appointment with Dr. Ferris and said nothing while she described, with rehearsed concern, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, 2 more incidents that had never happened, me wandering the backyard at 2 in the morning, me forgetting my own sister's name on the phone. I watched Dr. Ferris write it all down, and I smiled, of begging for scraps of love, and I thanked him for his time because I needed his notes exactly as fabricated as they were. A false record, once it exists, can be dated, compared, and disproven. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A record that never gets written can't be used against anyone. I found a small, unexpected ally in that stretch of weeks in the last place I expected one. My granddaughter, Lily Curtis, and Vanessa's 10-year-old. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, sharp-eyed and quiet in the particular way children get when they've learned that adults don't like being watched. She was staying with me one Saturday while Curtis and Vanessa handled errands, of begging for scraps of love, and somewhere around lunchtime, she looked up from her sandwich and said, very matter-of-fact, the way children deliver the most devastating truths, Mom told Grandma Denise you don't remember things right anymore. Begging for scraps of love. But you remembered my birthday was different from Aunt Brooks, and Mom always mixes those up, not you. I asked her gently if her mother talked about me often. She nodded, chewing, of begging for scraps of love. Unbothered by the weight of what she was saying, she practices stuff sometimes, like for a play. In the bathroom mirror, I heard her say your name a bunch of times, real sad sounding, of begging for scraps of love, and then she'd say it again different. She shrugged. It was weird. 10 years old, and she'd already caught, without knowing it, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the exact thing I'd spent 3 weeks trying to catch on camera, Vanessa rehearsing her own grief for an audience that hadn't gathered yet. I started sleeping with Walter's laptop beside my bed after that, of begging for scraps of love, checking the footage every morning, and on the 9th night of that new habit, the hallway camera caught her again. 11:40 in the evening, letting herself in, of begging for scraps of love. Moving not toward the front hall this time, but past it, toward the guest room, toward the fireplace, toward the mantel clock, she had somehow never quite gotten around to removing. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, she stood in front of it for almost a full minute. She touched the clock, she tilted her head at the brick behind it, the way you'd look at a wall you'd walked past 100 times without ever really seeing it. Of begging for scraps of love, and then I watched this 3 times before I could believe it. She reached toward the 3rd brick, pressed it once, lightly, distractedly, the way you'd test a loose tile. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and when it didn't give easily under that half-hearted pressure, she pulled her hand back, muttered something the camera's microphone caught only as an irritated exhale, and walked away. Of begging for scraps of love, she had been inches from finding everything Walter left me. She touched the exact brick, and because she was in a hurry, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because she'd already decided there was nothing in this house worth taking seriously except what she'd already planned to take, she missed it by less than an ounce of pressure and a few more seconds of patience. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I have thought about that moment more than almost any other in this entire story. How much of what happens to us in life comes down to someone else's contempt, costing them the one thing that would have stopped them. Of begging for scraps of love. 2 nights after that, my son called me, his voice tight in a way I hadn't heard since his father's funeral. "Mom," he said, "can we talk? Just us, tomorrow before Vanessa gets home from her mother's." Begging for scraps of love. Something in the careful way he said before Vanessa gets home told me he already sensed a fracture forming, somewhere he couldn't quite name yet. I told him yes, I did not tell him what I already knew, begging for scraps of love. Dramatic irony is a strange, heavy thing to carry inside your own chest, walking through your days pretending not to see a wall that's already halfway built around you. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, waiting for the exact right moment to knock it down instead of just stepping over it. He came the next morning before work, sat at my kitchen counter the way he used to when he was still a boy who told me everything, begging for scraps of love, and turned his coffee cup in slow circles without drinking from it. "Mom, is everything okay with you?" "Really okay. Vanessa's been saying." "What has Vanessa been saying, Curtis?" He looked down at the cup. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that you've been forgetting things, that maybe it's time we talked about options for your care. He said the word care like it tasted wrong in his mouth even as he said it. I looked at my son, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, 43 years old, standing at the edge of a decision that would define which family he actually belonged to, and I thought about his father's letter folded inside a cedar box behind a brick wall 20 feet away, begging for scraps of love, and I thought about the phrase I'd built my whole working life on. Preventance beats sentiment. Follow the paper, not the person. Come to the house Saturday, I told him. Bring your wife. 10 years of begging for scraps of bring. Sit down and actually listen not to what she says, to what she's built. I think it's time you saw all of it. He didn't know yet what that meant. He would in 6 days. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in a room full of people, standing in front of a fireplace his father built with his own hands, and it would break something open in him that had been shut for 6 long years, but 2 nights before that Saturday came, for scraps of love. Vanessa and her mother arrived at my house together, unannounced, with a folder I recognized instantly from the shape of it under Vanessa's arm, thick, tabbed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, bound with a rubber band, and they did not ask me to sit down and talk. They walked me into the guest room, the one with the fireplace, the one with the wall that held everything Walter had left me. And Denise said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in a voice that was gentle in exactly the way a closing door is gentle. "We just think it's safer, sweetheart, if you stay in here tonight, just until things calm down, just until Saturday." Of begging for scraps of love, and then I heard the lock turn from the outside, and I stood alone in a room whose walls held every piece of evidence that would end this. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, with the 2 women trying to destroy my life standing 3 feet away from it on the other side of a door, having no idea what they'd just locked me in with. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I stood very still in that locked room for exactly as long as it took to hear their footsteps recede down the hallway, and then I did something Vanessa and Denise would never have predicted. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because it never once occurred to either of them that being locked in that particular room might be the safest place in the entire house for me to be. I sat down on the floor in front of the fireplace, of begging for scraps of love, moved my grandmother's clock aside with hands that were, to my own quiet surprise, completely steady, and pressed the 3rd brick 3rd row down, of begging for scraps of love, the same brick Vanessa had touched 9 nights earlier without ever knowing what her fingertips had come within an inch of finding. The cavity behind it was exactly as I'd left it, the manila envelope, the cedar box, of begging for scraps of love, the deed, the codicil, the bonds. Walter's first letter still folded the way I'd folded it back. I didn't need any of that again tonight. Tonight I needed the closet. Walter's letter had told me there was a second one, of begging for scraps of love, under the 3rd floorboard for the day it actually gets bad. I hadn't looked yet, because until that lock turned from the outside, I hadn't been entirely sure the day had come. Now I was sure. Of begging for scraps of love. I crossed to the small closet on the far wall, knelt down on a knee that had been replaced 4 years earlier, and still complained about kneeling, of begging for scraps of love, and ran my fingers along the floorboards until I found one with a seam just slightly wider than its neighbors. It lifted with almost no resistance, like it had been waiting. Underneath was a second envelope, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Thinner than the first, and inside it a shorter letter, dated only 4 months before Walter died. I want to tell you what it said, because I think it's the reason I was able to sit calmly on that floor. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Locked in by two women who believed they'd finally cornered me instead of falling apart the way I suspect they were hoping I would. Nora, if you're reading this one, it means someone locked a door on you. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, or tried to, or you're standing somewhere feeling like the walls of your own life have started closing in. I need you to know something I never said out loud enough while I was alive. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because I was a man who built things instead of saying them. You were never the quiet one in this marriage. You were the patient one. There's a difference, and it's the whole difference. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Quiet people wait because they're afraid. You wait because you already know how the story ends and you're just letting everyone else catch up. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Whoever's on the other side of that door thinks they've won something tonight. They haven't. They've just given you a room with no distractions and all the proof you need. Use it. I love you. For scraps of love. Finish it the way you finish everything, completely, and on your own terms. I sat with that letter for a long time in the dark, and then I did exactly what he told me to do. I finished it. I still had my phone. Of begging for scraps of love. Vanessa, in her hurry to lock a door and feel powerful for the first time in this entire 6-year campaign, of begging for scraps of love, hadn't thought to take it from me because taking a phone from a woman she'd spent years insisting was harmless and confused would have meant admitting, even to herself, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that she actually believed I was dangerous to whatever she was planning. I called the one person I'd been saving for exactly this moment. Carol Voss and I had known each other for 26 years. Of begging for scraps of love ever since a nasty probate dispute over a set of appraisal figures I'd produced that she, sitting on the bench as a family court judge at the time, had trusted completely. Of begging for scraps of love. In a case where everyone else in the room had reason to want me to be wrong. She retired 4 years before I did. We'd had lunch every few months since, the way courthouse people do, birthday cards. Of begging for scraps of love. A phone call whenever something in the news reminded one of us of a case we'd both half forgotten. Carol, I said, keeping my voice low, I need your eyes on something, and I need it faster than I'd normally ask. Of begging for scraps of love. She came the next morning the moment Vanessa unlocked the door with a stiff, bright cheerfulness, saying only, "Sleep okay, Eleanor? We just wanted you somewhere calm," and let herself out to run an errand. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I let Carol in through the back, sat her at my kitchen counter with coffee, and laid out everything, the camera footage, the near miss on the brick, the deed, the codicil, Walter's 2 letters. Of begging for scraps of love. The overheard conversation with the man named Sallow in the garden center parking lot. My own log, 6 years of it, dated and sourced the way I'd trained myself to date and source everything worth remembering. Of begging for scraps of love. Carol read every page without speaking, watched 11 minutes of footage twice, and read the codicil 3 times before she finally looked up over her glasses. Eleanor, this is textbook. Isolation for scraps of love. Fabricated medical narrative, a paid consultant walking her through the filing requirements, financial extraction, and now unlawful confinement. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which is the part that turns this from a family dispute into something with actual criminal exposure. She paused. Has she filed anything yet? Not that I've found. Then you have time, but not much. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Locking that door was either overconfidence or panic, and panic means she's accelerating. You need Gordon Reyes, best elder law attorney in the state, and he'll know exactly how to use everything you just showed me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I called Gordon Reyes that afternoon. He listened for 40 minutes without interrupting, and when I finished, he said only, "Mrs. Whitfield, you don't need me to protect your house. Your husband already did that." Scraps of love. You need me to make the people trying to take it from you face consequences for trying. He asked one question before we hung up. Is there a gathering planned? A family conversation? Of begging for scraps of love? Anything with more than just the 2 of you? Saturday, I told him. My son asked everyone to come. Good, he said. That's our courtroom. I'll be parked on your street at 10. Text me when it's time. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I spent the days before 33 years, spending the days before any difficult appraisal, organizing, not agonizing, of begging for scraps of love. I downloaded every relevant clip of footage onto Walter's laptop in chronological order. I printed the deed, the codicil, both letters, my log, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and the bank records showing exactly where $18,000 of Curtis's and my joint savings had gone. I placed the cedar box, still holding the bonds, back on the guest room mantel where the framed live of begging for scraps of love. Love print had briefly stood, and I put Walter's toolbox, rescued from the curb, cleaned, oiled, the latch working smooth again. Beside it, Saturday morning, I woke before my alarm for scraps of love the way I always used to before a difficult day of appraisal work. I dressed simply. I made 1 cup of coffee and drank all of it, and I waited. They arrived at 10. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 8 people filing into my living room the way you'd file into a courtroom you'd already decided the verdict of. Curtis pale and unsettled. Vanessa in a cream-colored dress with pearl earrings, for scraps of love, a folder tucked under her arm. Denise, silver-haired and composed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Taking a seat toward the back, the way a woman takes a seat when she's watched a scene like this play out before and knows exactly how it's supposed to go. Vanessa's sister Brooke, scrolling her phone. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. My sister-in-law, Patricia, 2 cousins, and Curtis's coworker Dave, who I suspected had been invited mainly to make the room feel more official, more like a decision than an ambush. Begging for scraps of love. Vanessa stood at the front of my own living room, in front of my own fireplace, and opened her folder. "Thank you all for coming," she said in the gentle of begging for scraps of love. Rehearsed voice I now recognized from 4 months of nighttime footage and one very informative 10-year-old. "I know this is hard, but we're here because we love Mom, and we're worried about her." She called me Mom. For scraps of love. In 6 years of marriage to my son, she had never once called me that. She was saving it, I understood now. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the same way she'd been saving everything else, for the exact moment it would sound best on a record somewhere. She walked the room through a printed timeline of fabricated incidents, each one dated. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, each one delivered with the calm authority of someone reading a weather report. She described the wandering Lily had never actually witnessed, the medication confusion that had never happened, of begging for scraps of love, the growing concern of a physician who had in fact been fed every single detail he wrote down. She gestured toward the guest room down the hall, toward the crib still in its box, of begging for scraps of love, and said the sentence I'd been waiting 6 weeks to hear her say to my face in front of witnesses. "This house has outgrown you, Eleanor. We just think for your safety, it's of begging for scraps of love. It's time to talk about a more supervised arrangement. I've spoken with a consultant. I'm prepared to manage things for you." The room went quiet, of begging for scraps of love, the particular quiet of people who don't yet know whether they're allowed to disagree. I let it sit for 3 full seconds before I stood up. "Yes," I said. "I'd like to say something too." I walked to the guest room. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I came back carrying 2 things, Walter's laptop and his cedar toolbox, setting them both on the coffee table in the center of the semicircle Vanessa had arranged like a tribunal. Of begging for scraps of love. "My husband built this house with his own hands," I said, "and before he died, he installed a camera in the front hall of it. It's been recording for 4 years. Of begging for scraps of love. I'd like everyone to see a few minutes of what it caught." Vanessa's composed expression didn't crack, not yet, but something underneath it recalculated visibly. Of begging for scraps of love, the way a person's face changes when a variable they never accounted for walks into the room. "Renee?" "Eleanor, we don't need to. Sit down, Vanessa." Nobody had told Vanessa to sit down in 6 years. She sat. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I played the footage in order, her letting herself in at 11 at night, 3 separate times, weeks apart, her hand pressing the 3rd brick, testing it, giving up, of begging for scraps of love, walking away with less than an ounce of pressure standing between her and everything I now knew, her alone at her own bathroom mirror one evening, of begging for scraps of love, caught faintly through a cracked door in the hallway camera's wide angle, saying my name out loud, adjusting her expression, trying the sentence 3 different ways. "We love Mom." 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but she needs help, until she landed on the version with just the right amount of sorrow in it. And practiced that version 4 more times. The room watched Vanessa watch herself rehearse, in her own bathroom mirror, the exact speech she had just finished delivering word for word 40 minutes earlier. "This is a violation of my privacy," she said, but her voice had lost its footing. "It's my house," I said. "My camera." Of begging for scraps of love, my evidence, and you locked me inside the room that held all of it 2 nights ago, which I'd be careful about mentioning again if I were you. Years of begging for scraps of love, because that particular decision is the reason my attorney is currently parked on this street. That was when I picked up my phone, typed a single word, and sent it. 2 minutes later, the doorbell rang. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and Gordon Reyes walked into my living room in a gray suit with a briefcase in one hand, moving like a man who had walked into 100 rooms exactly like this one and knew precisely where to stand. "I'm Gordon Reyes, of begging for scraps of love, elder law attorney representing Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield," he said, setting 3 sets of documents on the coffee table beside Walter's laptop. "Of begging for scraps of love. This is a cease and desist addressed to Vanessa Hale Whitfield and Denise Hale, ordering the immediate halt of all activity related to a fraudulent capacity filing, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, unauthorized access to Mrs. Whitfield's medical records, and unauthorized financial withdrawal from a joint account. This is notice that an elder abuse investigation has been opened with Adult Protective Services, of begging for scraps of love based on 4 years of documented evidence, and this," he set the third downless stat deliberately, "is a criminal complaint for unlawful imprisonment filed this morning related to the locked door 2 nights ago. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Any capacity petition built on fabricated medical incidents constitutes perjury under state law should you choose to proceed with filing it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love." Denise stood up from the back of the room the way a director steps onto a stage they thought they controlled. "This is absurd. We were only trying to help. Eleanor's been struggling for years." Marjorie Hale. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I said. Denise went very still. 11 years ago, I said, county civil records, a guardianship petition filed by you against your own mother-in-law, granted within 60 days. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Her house, a 3-bedroom colonial worth just under $200,000, sold within 9 months. Marjorie moved to a state-funded facility. She died there 2 years later. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, with none of that money left to show for it because you were the one holding it. That was different, Denise said, her voice thinner than I'd ever heard it. Marjorie was actually declining. Of begging for scraps of love. She was vulnerable, I said, and you took advantage of it once, and it worked well enough that you taught your own daughter how to do it to someone who wasn't vulnerable at all. I'm not declining. Of begging for scraps of love. Denise, my mind is perfectly clear. Which is exactly why Vanessa had to manufacture the decline instead of finding one already there. Denise sat back down. Her face didn't crumble dramatically, it cracked quietly. Of begging for scraps of love. The particular hairline fracture you recognize if you've spent 33 years learning to read faces across a table for a living, Curtis hadn't moved since the first clip played. Of begging for scraps of love. He was staring at a point somewhere between the laptop and the fireplace, and when he finally spoke, his voice broke clean down the middle. Is any of it real? Anything you've told me about my mother? Any of it? For scraps of love, Vanessa reached for him. Curtis, your mother's manipulating. Stop, he said, and it came out raw, louder than I'd heard him speak in 6 years. Just stop. He turned to me. For scraps of love. And for the first time since his father died, watched him look like Walter, not in the shape of his face, but in the particular way grief and clarity can arrive in a person at exactly the same moment. Mom, begging for scraps of love. I'm sorry, I should have seen it. You weren't supposed to see it, Curtis, I said. That was the entire design. He pressed his palms against his eyes and let his shoulders move the way Walter's used to, up and in, Of begging for scraps of love, no sound, just pressure held too long, finally releasing. I let him sit with it. I didn't tell him it would be fine. I didn't tell him I forgave him yet, because I didn't. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Not in that moment. Forgiveness isn't something you hand out at the exact second someone finally sees the truth. It's something you decide to build later, carefully. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Once you've watched what they choose to do with the truth now that they have it. Vanessa gathered her folder, the rubber band, the 6 years of rehearsed sentences, and stood. "We're leaving," she said. To no one in particular, since Curtis wasn't moving toward the door with her. "You go," Curtis said, not looking up. "I'm staying with my mother." Vanessa looked at me one last time, begging for scraps of love, at the room full of people no longer watching her the way she'd spent 6 years training them to, and walked out. Denise followed her, the door closed. My living room, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, for the first time in longer than I could remember, was mine again. My sister-in-law, Patricia, stayed behind after everyone else filtered out. And she held on to my hands for a long moment before she said anything at all. 10 years begging for scraps of love. I believed her, Eleanor, every word for years. She called me every other week. Years of begging for scraps of love. I told her what I've come to believe is the truest thing I learned from this whole ordeal, that being fooled by a patient liar isn't the same thing as being careless, of begging for scraps of love, and she shouldn't spend the next 6 years punishing herself for it the way I very nearly let myself resent her for it in that first hour. She hugged me at the door and said she'd call every Sunday from now on. She has. Of begging for scraps of love. The cousins left more quietly, each one pausing at the threshold with some version of the same sentence. I should have asked you directly instead of just believing what I was told. Dave shook my hand and said, of begging for scraps of love, plainly that he was sorry for sitting in my living room and letting a stranger's timeline stand in for 6 years of actually knowing me. Brooke left without a word. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the same way she'd filmed my husband's toolbox going into a garbage bag without a word. Some people never find the sentence. That's its own kind of answer. Of begging for scraps of love. Curtis stayed in the kitchen with me for the rest of that afternoon, and eventually into the evening, sitting at the same counter where he used to do his homework as a boy. He asked, quietly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, about the $18,000, and I told him Gordon Reyes would handle the recovery of it through the civil complaint, that it wasn't his shame alone to carry. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that a man who signs a withdrawal slip because his wife told him it was for a nursery isn't the same as a man who plans a theft. He asked if he could stay the night, sleep on the couch, of begging for scraps of love, and I told him the couch was long gone, replaced years ago and never missed, and that his father's old reading chair, the one Vanessa had donated without asking, was as of that morning. Of begging for scraps of love. Being tracked down by a very motivated attorney's assistant who'd found the donation receipt in my kitchen drawer and traced it to a resale shop 2 towns over. I hated that white couch, Curtis said. For scraps of love, and he almost laughed, a short exhale of a sound, the first genuine one I'd heard from him in years. So did I said. Sleep in your old room, it never stopped being yours, before he went to bed. Of begging for scraps of love. I told him one more thing because I'd promised myself I would say it plainly once and then never need to say it again. I love you, Curtis. I have loved you every single day of your entire life. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, including the 6 years you spent believing I was someone I've never been. But if you ever let anyone manage access to me again without asking me directly first, you will lose more than my trust. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You'll lose the version of this relationship where I still open the door without checking who's behind it first. He nodded, and I believed, for the first time in a long while, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that he actually understood the difference between being forgiven and being fully trusted again. 2 words people use interchangeably that have never once meant the same thing in my experience. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. In 33 years of watching families try and fail to tell them apart, here's how it landed in the weeks that followed, because I think you deserve the actual accounting, not just the feeling of one, of begging for scraps of love. The capacity petition was never filed. Gordon Reyes confirmed, through the county clerk, that no paperwork bearing my name had ever been formally submitted. Vanessa had built the entire architecture of it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, right up to a signature line waiting for a judge's ink, and never quite crossed the final threshold. Whether out of remaining hesitation or simple bad timing, I'll never fully know and have stopped needing to. Of begging for scraps of love. The criminal complaint for unlawful imprisonment moved forward. Vanessa was charged and after 4 months accepted a plea that included a formal restraining order requiring supervised contact only. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a public record of the finding and restitution. The $18,000 came back in full within 90 days, under threat of a parallel civil suit. Gordon assured me we would absolutely have won. Of begging for scraps of love. Denise received a separate cease and desist, and though the statute of limitations on what happened to Marjorie Hale 11 years earlier had long since expired, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the record itself was formally reopened for review by the state's Adult Protective Services Office, which meant that somewhere in a filing cabinet, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the truth about what happened to that other woman finally exists in writing, even if it came 11 years too late to help her. Vanessa filed for divorce 2 months later, not Curtis Vanessa. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I understood immediately what that meant. She had built her entire architecture around control, and once she could no longer control the story, staying inside it became a liability instead of a strategy. For scraps of love. Curtis moved back into the guest room temporarily, he says, though it has now been 8 months, and he has repainted the fireplace mantel his father built. Of begging for scraps of love. Refinished the floorboard I once lifted with my own hands in the dark and reupholstered the reading chair Gordon's assistant tracked down at a resale shop for $80, which felt, when it finally came home, of begging for scraps of love like the cheapest and most valuable purchase of my entire life. Lily still stays with me most Saturdays. She asked me once, not long after everything settled, how I knew where to look behind that brick. It's of begging for scraps of love that her grandfather trusted me to be patient enough to find it when I needed it, and that trust, real trust, 10 years of begging for scraps of love is really just a kind of faith that someone will still be paying attention long after everyone else has stopped looking. She thought about that for a while. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way 10-year-olds think about things that are slightly too large for them. And then she said, I'm going to pay attention to everything now, and I believed her because she already had been, the whole time, for scraps of love. While the rest of us were too busy being fooled to notice a child quietly keeping score, I still keep the front hall camera running. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, not because I'm afraid anymore, because it was the last thing my husband gave me before he died, without either of us knowing at the time exactly what it would eventually be asked to prove. For scraps of love. Some widows keep a shirt that still smells right. I kept a $9.99 subscription and a small red light blinking steadily by my own front door, and I am not turning it off. I think a lot, 10 years of begging for scraps of love these days, about the difference between forgiveness and trust because I promised myself I'd stop confusing them the way so many families do. I have forgiven my son. Of begging for scraps of love. I forgave him the night he sat at my kitchen counter and asked me, brokenly, whether any of it had been real. Forgiveness was never the hard part. He was grieving. Of begging for scraps of love. And grief left a door open in him that someone patient and calculating knew exactly how to walk through. But trust is a separate thing entirely, something you rebuild in small, deliberate increments. Of begging for scraps of love the way Walter built this house, one Saturday at a time. Check twice, measured true before you ever nail it down. Curtis and I are rebuilding that slowly, begging for scraps of love, and I have told him plainly that slow is not the same as unwilling. It's just honest. I sit in Walter's reading chair most evenings now. It's of begging for scraps of love. In front of the fireplace he built with reclaimed brick from a schoolhouse 2 towns over, and sometimes I move the mantel clock aside just to look at the third brick, 3rd row down. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Not because I need anything else that's hidden behind it, but because it reminds me of something I don't ever want to stop knowing. That patience isn't the same thing as weakness. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that the quietest person in the room is very often the only one who has actually been counting the whole time, and that a man who loves you enough to build a wall around your safety, begging for scraps of love, in a house he'll never live to see you defend, has given you something far more permanent than comfort. He's given you proof, and proof, unlike promises, holds still exactly where you left it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, waiting for the day you finally need it to speak for you. If this reminded you to look a little closer at the walls of your own life, the people managing your calendar, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the doors someone else has started locking, share it with the woman in your life who needs to hear it today. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who was counting on it, tell me in the comments of begging for scraps of love, because I read every single one and I believe every single one. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, because I promise you, of begging for scraps of love, there is always another quiet woman out there who is holding every card the whole time.